Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week we investigate the plumbing of our democracy with public innovation pioneer Sir Geoff Mulgan. But first, our wrap of the latest news from around the globe with regular panellists Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton.
It's great to be back for another discussion on burning platforms, our second for 2026. Regular panellists joining us from Melbourne, Lizzie O'Shea, Chair of Digital Rights Watch. Hi, Lizzie.
Hi, Pete.
And Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton all the way in Perth. Welcome aboard.
G'day, Peter. G'day, Lizzie.
And we've got a special guest. I think this is the first time we have been graced with a knight in our present, but Sir Geoff Mulgan, who is visiting Australia at the moment, Professor of Collective Intelligence in Public Policy and Social Innovation at the University College London, former CEO of Nesta, worked for Blair, worked for Brown, seems to have worked for everyone. I think, Geoff, you had a short stint in Australia as a thinker in residence as well for the South Australian government. So it's going to be great to get your thoughts and wisdom and a bit of the thinking that you're doing around how we can make people less stupid. So thanks for joining us and welcome.
Thank you.
So I have warned Geoff that this is loose, as all of our listeners know, but we start off with our survey of the big stories that have been catching our eye from around the world. And let's start off, Dan, with the essay that Dario Ameida has put out in the last week. Now, we were talking about what we read over summer at our first show back. It seems that if you're a tech overlord, you don't read, you write. And he's put together a very comprehensive essay around what he's describing as the adolescence of AI. Before we dive into it, the background, of course, is that this is the guy that set up Anthropic when he came to the conclusion that OpenAI was no longer on the path of good. He is somebody that's in the camp of being concerned about the impact of AI, but also very committed to building AGI very, very quickly. So what's the essay about and what did you take from it?
Yeah, it was a very long essay.
It was, wasn't it? It's like a short book.
Yeah, it took me the better part of yesterday to read through it, but I found it pretty compelling. And it follows an essay that he wrote a year ago, I think also on his holidays, which was sort of an optimistic take or the most positive view, if you can, of where we're going with AI. That one was called Machines of Loving Grace. And yeah, this one focused more, as you said, on all the downsides, which I'll come back to. So the essay, it dealt with 5 main risks, which I'll talk about, but it was built on an assumption that effectively AGI or takeoff was going to happen, as quickly as the end of this year or 2027. And he's basically saying that on the rate of current progress, AI models will possess capabilities that are matching or exceeding those of a Nobel Prize winner across most disciplines by the end of this year or early next. But the key here is what's going to enable that, so-called takeoff is we're within spitting distance of machines being able to train themselves. So at the moment, the training process is very expensive and very arduous. But as soon as you have, these machines which are able to effectively start training themselves and coming up with novel ways to do that, we're going to have takeoff. I'm pretty skeptical of that. I think quite a few people are pretty skeptical of that as a possibility. But nonetheless, I think it's worth taking. I mean, he's obviously far more informed about this than pretty much anybody on the planet. So I think it's worth taking his assumptions seriously. And even if he's wrong about that, but right about the potential of the technology to have a massive impact on most industries, which I think he is right about, and the question is how big an impact, then I think it's worth considering what he's got to say. So he called out 5 main risks, and there's one of them in particular I want to focus on. So he talked about autonomy risks. So that's, effectively if we get takeoff, the misalignment problem, and the machines enslave us all, and we end up in the Terminator, which again I'm a bit skeptical of, but I guess we can discuss. there's the misuse. This was probably the theme of last week's show, or last fortnight's show, which I don't know if I want to revisit because it was a pretty depressing show at the end of it. But basically talking about bad actors using this tech to do bad things, particularly around sort of biotech and the like, which seems to be a problem that we should be worrying about. The third one was the misuse for seizing power. Now, whether that's a country or more likely one of these large companies, and that's what I want to talk about. Before I get to that, though, then there was the economic disruption. And I think this is absolutely going to be a problem. The question is how big, because you're going to be able to automate, a lot more in a lot more industries than we currently can. And then there's sort of, I guess, flowing on from that, the fifth issue was the indirect effects. And if the world is going to change really, really quickly, what does that do for society and liberal democracy and everything else? So, look, we could spend the whole show talking about these 5 problems. It'll be very on brand for burning platforms to do that. But there's one in particular that I want to focus on for now, and that's just the misuse for seizing power. Because at the moment, there's only really a handful of companies that are building this frontier tech, and that is Anthropic, obviously with Claude, OpenAI, Google with DeepMind and what they're doing with Gemini, probably Elon Musk and what he's doing with X, and then the fifth one, which doesn't get a lot of attention but probably should, is Meta. And Meta had their earnings call this week and surprised everyone with the upside potential of it, right? So they've upped their ad load on their products and they're getting away with that, and they're making a huge amount of money. But what was interesting about that is that at the same time that Zuckerberg has announced that, he's also announced that they're about to invest about US $120 billion this calendar year alone in AI. So just to put that in perspective, that is their entire free cash for the year that he's planning to invest in this product, or in this sort of, not this product, but this technology. So that'll be used to, generate content, for example, to drive engagement on their platforms, which I guess we would expect, and we've spoken about before, that there'd be more personalized targeting of ads. We're already seeing that, and we're already seeing it become more effective. But the third one is probably less well defined, but, he is explicit about he's trying to build super intelligence or AGI or whatever you want to call it. He's explicit about wanting to get to take off first. What worries me is that, I think the best case scenario is still problematic, but the best case scenario is that a company like Anthropic, if takeoff does happen, that they get there first. I do worry if it's a company like X or Meta, which has got a pretty bad track record of showing what their most important values are, or most important things are, and primarily that's around making money and driving engagement and bugger the consequences. So I guess it just proves the undemocratic nature of this technology and the fact that there are no guardrails around it. I'm not sure what we can do about it, but perhaps one of you has a solution.
Yeah, Lizzie, one of the other things that just caught my attention today coming out of Anthropic as well is this bizarre Malt book, which is a Reddit-style site for AI bots to talk to AI bots, which seems to be the future of Meta/Facebook in a world of superintelligence. Like, I know you hate talking about the catastrophism because you want to talk about what's happening now, but what do you make of the essay and what it means to the way that we are discussing those issues?
It does strike me in the framing of the essay that it's very deterministic, as in it talks about technology and its development as an inevitable force, and that there's very little that we can do to stop it. Like, if people hadn't developed the tech in this way, someone else would have. If a state didn't do it, then an authoritarian state would do it. It is very fatalistic, I suppose, about the inevitability of AI, right, and it developing in this way. One of the things that I think is, of course, left out is that there are a bunch of decision points that have led to this. And I did this experiment, which sort of worked, I don't know, but people may wish to think about this when they're reading the essay themselves if they choose to do so. Like, I was substituting the word AI with wealth, because the way you concentrate extreme wealth and then give the capacity to create these foundation models that have huge investment costs, right, and then the sense that it needs to be recovered for those investors, of course, not a sense, a compulsion. It does create certain incentives, certain framing of the topic. Like, it's a perennial bugbear of mine and many others in this community that when you talk about AI, you're talking about specific kinds of models, like the one that Anthropic's got, Meta or whatever. You're not talking about small language models or different kinds of other uses of AI, but in fact, everything machines that these large tech companies that and household names are building, because they've accumulated huge amounts of wealth, including from venture capitalists, not just the companies themselves, but it's the way the society's been structured that's facilitated an orientation towards this being the technology that we talk about when we talk about AI, but also a fatalistic understanding of what is going to take place in terms of its development. So, of course, I'm going to say I need to reframe the question. I'm not sure I accept the terms of what he's doing here, but I find it pretty interesting, I suppose, that these are supposed to be some of the biggest minds in society, right? They're running these huge companies in frontier spaces, and they've accepted a huge number of the parameters of what it is to be developing this kind of tech and what its capabilities are and where we might go. And that is a lack of imagination, but it's also kind of self-serving. So I find this whole debate very frustrating. Like, it doesn't mean that it's not a compelling essay in what it's doing, but there's a lot left out of what might be possible if we did things differently. But I suppose that's my job to say those things.
Geoff, the other thing that seems to be an undercurrent here, though, is that this is such a risk that we need to do it first because otherwise the CCP will do it. Is that a good enough reason to be jumping off cliffs without knowing how far down we're going?
That's the argument that's been made for the last 10 years against every government. Don't stop us, because if you do in any way, the Chinese will get there first. I mean, I thought this was a pretty interesting essay, and Anthropic is in such a weird place at the moment, in deep conflict with the US state, which currently dislikes them quite intensely, David Sachs. And I thought quite a lot of points he made were pretty right. I mean, Dan mentioned the Meta investment just announced, which is about 6 or 7 times the entire UK public R&D budget. So this mismatch between corporate innovation and anything democratic is just widening very rapidly in front of our eyes. And I thought he was quite good on a really important issue, which I think is often misunderstood, which is that any kind of advanced intelligence, and I'm always been skeptical of AGI or a singularity, but I think the idea that it will have some degree of autonomy, its own survival will be a priority for it, is important and very hard for us to understand because we're used to dumb machines, which were tools which we could use. And I think we're already beginning to see what happens when you create very powerful entities which will know all about human psychology and how to manipulate us and deceive us. In the short run, that works for Meta and so on, and targeted advertising. But in the not too distant future, that will work with the AIs working to manipulate Meta or anyone else. And that is an absolutely unprecedented challenge in human history, which I didn't think he offered many answers to it, but at least he's raising it as something we should be worried about. And China is very worried about that, incidentally. And in a way, the Chinese debate, I think, is in some ways more advanced than the Western debate in recognizing the civilizational threat of wholly unregulated AI.
Tell us a little bit more about that, not in massive detail, but that's fascinating.
Well, I think in the last decade, China saw AI as one of the things which would help drive growth and so on. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, you saw the debates within the Communist Party and elite circles beginning to recognize that once you have ubiquitous AI, which means you can create fakes, misinformation, and so on, is not just that you weaken control of the party, but any kind of cultural civilization becomes impossible. And that's why they brought in all these laws over the last few years, the Cyberspace Administration and so on, to try and contain this while also funneling vast sums of money into driving AI, which is paying off with DeepSeek and so on. But there's been a much more sophisticated, maybe post-adolescent debate in some respects in China, whereas our debate is still a bit infantile, either, hey, this is the answer to everything, or hey, this is a monster we have to kill. I think we have to be much more granular and nuanced about the details.
Geoff, just before we move on, it's interesting to hear you talk about that, because the impression that I get from everything I read about what China is doing is that they're much more focused on the practical deployment of this technology than trying to get some ill-defined AGI, superintelligence, what have you. You know, it seems that they're perhaps even ahead of us in a lot of areas, or ahead of the West in a lot of areas in how they are deploying AI because of that, right? They seem to be burning less cash on that side of things. Have I got that wrong? What's your take?
Yeah, and if I had to make a prediction, I would say the AGI debate will go exactly the way the Turing test debate has gone. So remember, for decades, people said this was the great thing we had to worry about, a Turing test. Then it was passed again and again and again. And now people say that's a rather uninteresting debate. I think we'll have lots of different GIs, not a single AGI, and it will just look like a weird sort of blip that people became so obsessed with this idea there'd be a moment in 2027 when suddenly you would achieve sort of takeoff an AGI. China never really got into that debate, as you say. It's much more about pragmatic applications in all sorts of fields. And in part, that was a pragmatic choice because they thought they never could outcompete the US on foundational models and so on. But I think it's also perhaps has a philosophical basis, as you suggest.
So one of the ways that we need to hold all these technologies to account is with the scrutiny of academics, such as yourself, Geoff, but also across the academy. Lizzie, you've put forward a pre-paper that's coming out, I think, in the next few weeks, looking at the degree to which the big tech companies are funding the research and asking questions about whether that's going to lead to those sorts of insights we need.
Yeah, this caused a bit of a fuss. It's a preprint article, right? So, but Science was reporting on it, science.org was reporting on it, which suggests that 1/3 of studies on social media that appear in major interdisciplinary journals have authors with ties to industry that in normal circumstances you would expect to be disclosed but aren't. And I think what we're seeing is a moment where there might be a rethink about what needs to be disclosed and what doesn't. There's all sorts of ways in which I think industry influences research. I mean, that's true across all industries. So this is not a particularly novel problem. And it's been more insidious and less over time. Of course, there's notorious examples of things like tobacco and fossil fuels where companies were involved in commissioning research to downplay their own corporate responsibility associated with certain harmful products. In this instance, I think there's lots of nuanced ways in which technology companies can influence academic research. So that can include straight up funding and the like, but also collaboration, access to information, and similar. Like these companies hold lots of information about their users and the potential for their products to be harmful or to be otherwise. And I think there is a problem with facilitating access to that to certain academics and what that then cultivates. So, one of the things I liked, for example, about the mis and disinfo bill that was ill-fated on 2 separate occasions in the previous government was that it did involve disclosure that then would potentially be available to academics and researchers to examine about how some of the decision-making goes on as to what is favoured in your feed, what kinds of inputs go into the algorithm. And I saw benefits there because I think that should be a role of government and regulators to make that plain, to encourage that kind of reporting so that then the research into this field isn't limited to people that have good relationships with industry and can get access to that information, which is, I think, unfortunately, a bit of a reality when it comes to some of this research. So I think there's a real scope here to have a bit of a reassessment as to what is the involvement of industry in research, probably also civil society, dare I say it, and how they're involved in funding some of this work and then what influence that might have on the parameters of the debate. And I don't think it's as blunt as people advocating to protect these companies or anything like that. But it does, I think, have implications for what kinds of policy solutions you can for particular kinds of problems. The thing I'd say before I hand it over to others to pass judgment on this is that I think there is a real complexity around this field that, again, is a common problem in academia where you have to grapple with the fact that the technology or the issue is moving very fast. Academic research might suggest certain things, but not others. Sometimes that is used in a way that is very bad for good policymaking. Like if we do want evidence-based policymaking, what do we do when the evidence is uncertain? I think the debate around the social media ban, for example, for young people is an example of that, where some people are talking about it being very definitive evidence. There's a lot of research suggests that the link is much more complex, but politically, there's particular policy being put forward.
But there, Lizzie, it was interesting that the pushback from those promoting the social media ban were attacking the academics that were pushing back on the policy, saying they were receiving money from the tech.
Yeah, well, it's complicated, right? Like, I don't think it's always a good, there's political factors that mean that even high-quality academic research isn't always listened to or used as part of evidence-based policymaking. There is an argument, I think, in circumstances where some of this research is evolving at a fast pace, and the issue is evolving at a fast pace, where you should be able to facilitate greater collaboration between policymakers or government decision makers and academics, the academy, to both seek to orient the academy towards answering questions that would be useful for policymakers, but also find a way to share some of the research in a way that they know might not be taken and used in political ways that they didn't perhaps intend as researchers. So I think we're going to have to find ways to build like a relationship of trust between these kinds of institutions that operate often in different ways. And it's a ongoing problem. It's not new, but it does come into quite sharp relief in circumstances where, like this, where there's such a rapid pace of development and there's so much uncertainty, but there's potentially political manoeuvring that is going to advantage certain people's careers, but maybe at the expense of evidence-based policy making. And it's a real challenge. And I think it's time that we started thinking a bit more innovatively about how we could make sure that dynamic works well rather than badly.
Geoff, you've been on multiple sides of this fence, both at Nesta and also now working in academia. How do you think that through?
I pretty much agree with Lizzie, and I divide into three separate issues. I think one is that social media companies in particular are sitting on our society's most best stock of research and knowledge, enormous troves of data. And a few years ago, they did make quite a lot of moves to open that up to academics. Certainly Facebook did, Twitter, Google to a bit lesser extent. I think that's pretty much all gone into reverse in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's now pretty hard to access that. And I think that should be part of their license to operate, is that they share that suitably anonymized and so on with researchers, because that's how we find out a lot about what's happening in our society. I think on the funding issue, academics don't have much money. Of course, they're going to want to be funded. But as Lizzie said, it's absolutely vital there has to be transparent. And there's been endless arguments in fields like medicine about that. I would say if an academic actually doesn't admit to the funding they're getting from a major interest, whether corporate or any other kind, they should lose their job. That's the most basic ethical principle of being a professor at a university, that you can have an opinion, but you've got to be clear if someone has funded the research which happens to align with their interests. And that's become, as you say, very blurred in debates around social media and so on. Just on your last point, though, on evidence-based policy making, I'm a great believer in it, but I don't think there is any, because in almost any real-life topic, the evidence is pretty complicated and messy and contradictory, and anyone on either side of a debate will want to say the evidence proves X or Y, yet most of the things we're probably talking about here on impacts of social media, let alone AI impacts, when you really look at the evidence, it is pretty complicated and contradictory and messy. And that's fine, but we just need to be honest about that.
Dan, this got you thinking about the the land wars from 2020.
Yeah, I mean, this just seems it's a problem, but it's a problem which has surfaces in many different ways, right? So the big tech platforms obviously have a huge amount of money, and they spend that money to try and influence public debate. This is one way that they do it, and obviously that should be disclosed and everything else. And I'm a former journalist, and that seems pretty basic to me. But what's perhaps harder is that they are also one of the major funders of all of the industry organisations that exist. And I've been involved in a few of those industry organisations, and that gives them a huge amount of influence and sometimes board positions. And they have all these beautiful offices around the world, which they're very happy to have civic society have events at and those sort of things. So I think, they're pretty sophisticated in how they go about influencing the debate. This is part of it. I don't even know if it's the biggest problem. I just think there's such a massive part of our society now, and such a massive part of knowledge work in particular, that the relationships that they form, good people, by the way, but the relationships that they form through all of these efforts gives them a huge amount of influence over the debate. And I just think it skews things massively. I don't know how you solve for that. I mean, you can solve it. You can be better on this side of things by transparency and declaring conflicts of interest and those sort of things. But how do you solve it when, Facebook is hosting an event from, I don't know, some civil society group that and forming relationships off the back of that? I mean, that's a much more difficult problem to solve.
And just to round it out, Lizzie, it's really challenging even for organisations like your own, like who are cash strapped, and then big tech will say, we want to fund civil society because it will create better feedback loops for us. Where are the lines drawn?
Yeah, I think that's a big challenge, because also it's one thing to say, oh, you shouldn't take money from big tech, although I would point out we don't currently take money from big tech, to the extent it depends how you define it. There are technology companies that we take money from, but they're not big ones, right? But I do think that's one thing to say. But it's interesting because I think, in fact, they have often a more sophisticated understanding of the need for civil society, even when they disagree with what they're doing, as compared to lots of other organisations that might fund you that want very strict project work done that you have to report on every cent, and you have to comply with their set view. Whereas I think there's so much money sloshing around the tech industry, they often fund people and then don't really mind what happens. That's not a sustainable way of building civil society, don't get me wrong. But I think it's also one thing to criticise big tech funding civil society if you don't have a solution for it, because we need people working in this space that don't have an agenda, and we need to create circumstances for them to do it and to give the community a voice, right, and to find ways to represent large numbers of people who are interested in a particular topic coming together and working on this stuff. And I just don't know that our funding regimes have caught up with the need to do that. And I think we've got to do some work about doing it. Like in other industries, it does happen. Financial counsellors are funded through a regime that the government set up, which includes, getting industry to put there's all sorts of different ways to do it, like CPRE damages, so damages from litigation where it isn't allocated to somebody, but it's a civil penalty, or it's excess funds left over that don't go to anybody. Maybe that should go into these kinds of things. There's ways to fund it. Certainly in the US, penalties associated with breaches of their privacy regime can go into these funds. But there are things like that we need to explore, but that involves a commitment also from policymakers that they think civil society is important and worthwhile and contributes to the debate. And in the absence of that, I think you're left with, like with good quality research, you're left with then private entities with large amounts of money being able to influence the space because others don't want to invest in it.
That's really interesting. I do want to talk about that notion of friction when we get deeper into Geoff's work. I want to quickly just give my little snippet for the week. I feel like I'm becoming the harbinger of good news in 2026, which is ironic. But I did see that the South Koreans have passed an AI Basic Act, the full translation being the Basic Act on the Development of Artificial Intelligence and the Establishment of a Foundation for Trustworthiness. It's seen as a middle ground between the EU rule-based, the US, UK, and I might add Australia now's market-driven approach and China's state-led policy. So the idea, you've got an AI committee that's advising the president, updating their laws every 3 years. The thing that really stood out to me was invisible digital watermarks for clearly artificial outputs, such as cartoons or artwork. Realistic deep fakes, visible labels are required. That's one down from banning them altogether, of course, Dan. But also high impact AI, including systems for medical diagnosis, requires full risk assessments on how decisions are made. And the requirement of safety reports. There's been a lot of commentary around how the rules will support both AI development and trust. There's obviously also pushback that the laws don't go far enough, or more to the point, are not specific enough to be enforceable. But it seems like there's a consensus this is probably as far as a middle power has gone. It feels like almost an AI companion to Carney's Davos speech last week, that middle powers might be able to work together. And I just felt there was a little bit of a sense, well, there is a sense growing that it's just too hard to do anything that is going to particularly, hamper the operations of the American tech companies under Trump. South Korea's doing it. I know you've spent some time over there, Geoff. Any thoughts on these laws and whether that's consistent with how that country's approached technology in the past?
Yeah, but it is very much in the spirit of the new government. I was there just over a year ago, in fact, a week before the coup d'etat, which is then brought in, the
Your fault,
current.
Geoff?
No one was expecting it to be included. But in a way, the new president and the new majority, which are centre left, are trying to strike a different balance than the previous regime. I think what they're saying is perfectly reasonable, but with two major caveats, but they're caveats which apply to everyone. One is the safety bit, the last one you mentioned. I still have no idea what that really means in practice. I think it's completely misconceived, this generic idea of safety applied to any AI, but it's something my government has pursued as well. And I'm almost certain that in such a fast-moving technology field, you can't do things through laws, even laws, revised every 3 years. You have to create entities which are given power to act much more quickly, much more adaptively, as technologies change. And really the whole legalistic model of regulation, which dominated the last 60 or 70 years and still dominates actually in the Korean thinking, is a bit anachronistic. And I was slightly disappointed they haven't yet created the entity which will be able to navigate, iterate in response to technology. But it's a reasonable start.
Anything from either of you guys? Otherwise, we might just dive into Geoff's work, given that the clock's left.
Yeah, let's get into Geoff.
So, look, Geoff, officially you're here on sabbatical, but I feel like you're here to teach us. And I know you've come over under the auspices of both the Human Technology Institute at UTS and ANU. You had some input into some work we've been doing on building better feedback loops between citizen and government and thinking through civic infrastructure. So I guess, what are you hoping to get out of your time in Australia? And more to the point, what are you here to teach us?
Don't know about that. I mean, I've worked quite a lot in the past with quite a few of your state governments and the Commonwealth government and some universities, and I always learn a lot. And even more today when other parts of the world are going completely crazy, as in the US 2 weeks ago, which is insane. Most of Europe is a bit insane. Australia feels like a bastion of sanity and thoughtful discone about important issues.
That's always been the case, hasn't it?
Wish you luck. But anyway.
And one of the specific things I'm going to be working on here, well, partly with the HTI, a lot of their work is on new ways of using data and computer science and graph knowledge to understand complex issues, which is a really interesting topic for me. It's the next generation of kind of evidence-based policy. But the work, Peter, you were involved in on democracy seems to me the most important issue in the world. How do we save, restore, reinvent, reimagine democracy in ways which convince generations all over the world who are turning against democracy, have lost confidence in it, that it's something worth caring about, worth reinventing, worth imagining? And this goes back to the earlier conversation. Last year, what was it, 1.5 trillion spent on AI. How much was spent on AI for democracy? Almost nothing. So we've got this incredible mismatch of the brain power, the best brains of the world in DeepMind, OpenAI, all these places doing fantastic work. And I'm actually a great admirer of those companies. And yet many of the things which matter most to our future and our lives are just getting nothing like the same attention, but probably need it much more than how to do the next generation of targeted advertising.
One of the analogies I love that you use is that of the plumber. So we always talk about government being about the poetry of elections and the prose of governing, but you talk about the plumbing of engineering. So if you come in as a plumber and you look at modern democracy, where are the blockages, and do we need to lay totally new pipes, or is it just about clearing out the shit that's there?
Well, so Mario Cuomo, as you say, 50 years ago said, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. And I thought that was slightly wrong, because actually I think nowadays you have to govern with poetry, prose, and plumbing. So you've got to have the poetry, the story, the big ideas, the vision. The prose is all your policies, and then the plumbing is your machineries of government. And for various reasons, many of our political systems have lost interest in the plumbing. It hasn't been reformed, revised, modernized at all over many years. And most of our plumbing is 19th century. In London, literally, our plumbing is 19th century still, which causes all sorts of problems. So you have to create, new pipes, new systems, new ways of using intelligence in particular. But that on its own, that's not enough unless you also have the prose and the poetry, which makes sense of it all into coherent narrative. So when I work quite a bit with politicians, but I also work a lot with bureaucracies, and I'm a professor of engineering now. So I guess I oscillate between the poetry and the really boring stuff. My most recent publication a week or so ago was on discount rates, which is probably the most boring topic you could imagine, but actually has a huge impact on people's lives. But it's pure plumbing.
So excite us about the plumbing. Give us a story about how plumbing can change the way a system works.
Well, everything you talk about in this program, I mean, all of what is being done by Anthropic and so on is plumbing. It's computer science. It's maths. It's deeply rethinking how you organize information and knowledge in entirely new ways. And at the heart of it are the technicians, the computer scientists, the programmers, who are in a way the plumbers of the digital world. They'll have a front person who does the marketing and the spiel and so on, but in a way that the value is coming from the plumbers. And one of the things which is striking in governments is how few governments have people with any backgrounds in science, tech, or engineering at their highest levels. In my country, literally not a single member of the cabinet has any background in these things. China is very different. China is a country partly still run by engineers, a bit less than in the past.
Dictatorship of engineers, yeah.
It has some virtue over dictatorship by lawyers or con men, or some of the other options you have on the table. And I think you need a balance. Obviously, you don't want dictatorship of engineers, but you do need some people who care about how things happen as well as what is to be done. And in many countries, I say the UK is a bad example. The US is an extreme one. You've got everything about sort of words, essentially, and talk and language, and and it's the media and the political class completely uninterested in the practicalities of how do you run schools, how do you handle welfare. And it is kind of inherently boring, I have to confess, but that's actually what makes the world go round.
Do you think, Geoff, one of the reasons that people don't focus on the plumbing enough is partly a function that it feels like government for the last 4 or 5 decades has really been focused on this idea that you need to get out of the way of private industry, then really let them do their job, and that, bureaucracies are a problem and they get in the way of that and they slow it down. And I mean, I don't agree with that, of course, but that has been a big philosophy in government. So then you neglect that kind of, I guess, managerial aspect of government. I mean in the economic sense, like it's much more like government's role is structural interventions in that way, but really letting people, enterprise, do what they want. And I think it's interesting in the tech industry setting how that's unfolded, because there's been a bit of controversy this week, in particular around, say, OpenAI, I mean, it's not a revelation, but talking about the fact that one of the co-founders, Greg Brockman, is one of the largest donors to the Trump administration, putting in $25 million. Like, the tech industry does want government to get out of the way. Like, it wants to do them to work in partnership with them to create that kind of supremacy. And I just do wonder, like, how do you rebuild the idea that bureaucracy, we should stop by not calling it bureaucracy, but it has a role to play in making society better, like reorienting things that the market does towards things that are in the common benefit. I mean, is that too blunt? Maybe that's not the poetry we need. Tell me what poetry we need.
No, I agree with you. But it was a very deliberate argument in the 70s and 80s from the Reaganites, the Thatcherites, that government's inherently incompetent, non-innovative, non-creative. So if you want a thriving society, scale it back, get out of the way, and let the private sector do what it does well, which includes a lot of plumbing and making stuff and delivering services. And I think that argument is massively overshot. It had some great important grains of truth, and I'm not anti-market at all. But I teach people from governments all over the world. And I often start by asking, what are the biggest advances of humanity in the last 150 years? And we look at all sorts of things from child mortality to education. All of them were the product of bureaucracy. None of them happened at all just because of the market. They needed very good, competent bureaucracies. And the same will be true in the future. One of the things I focus on a lot at the moment is the design of next generation public institutions, because one effect of that Thatcherite, Reaganite argument was almost no thinking was done about how can you redesign public institutions in the age of data, AI, digital, and so on. So all over the world, they still look pretty much the same as they did 50 years ago, 80 years ago. They're big pyramid, bureaucracies, very hierarchical, very stiff. And we've been working on very different models, much more drawing on platforms and algorithms, but also biological metaphors of how you might design things. And I think that's quite liberating and is vital to the next generation of bureaucracy, which really can fix problems, can do the plumbing well. But the plumbing methods of 2026 are really different from 20 years ago or 50 years ago. And most governments haven't got that. They're mainly still defending old institutions against attack from Donald Trump and Musk and co, rather than asking, okay, well, we've got all these amazing tools at hand. How do we use them to design institutions for mental health, or regulating AI, or building infrastructures, or mobilizing capital? And to me, that's a really exciting possibility of the next few years. And it needs some of the brains of the open AIs and deep minds and so on, but working with bureaucrats and politicians to just imagine you were building a new nation, you were creating your institutions from scratch. They wouldn't look anything like the public institutions we have now.
So Geoff, let's talk about some of those brains that you just touched on at the end there, because this relates to a question I had for you. Because I mean, one of the problems with the way the water's gone since Thatcherism and Ronald Reagan and everybody else is that the plumbers, again, we probably need a better term than that, or the bureaucracy or whatever else. It's much more attractive, and the trend is away from the public sector and towards private enterprise. And getting really talented people to want to work for government is a pretty difficult thing, and it's getting more difficult too, especially as these companies now are effectively have the economic scale and in a lot of ways the power of nation states in any case, right? So they're more appealing places for the builders to go and work. I mean, does this ever come into your thinking about sort of a way of swinging that pendulum back a little bit, so you can get some of the really talented people in society to want to work for government again and want to put some of the plumbing in place for the benefit of society and not just for profit?
I'll push back a bit on what you said. I think in many countries, the brightest people actually do want to work in public purpose or government. Certainly Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries like Singapore, China, Japan, even in Britain, actually, the civil service is again the favorite topic, sort of place for graduates to go. So I think that has actually rebalanced compared to perhaps 20 or 30 years ago. But there's a very specific problem on AI and advanced digital, where anyone with any depth of knowledge or expertise can earn such vastly bigger sums working for the oligopoly companies than they can in government. And for that, the answer is often to try and get them to do secondments of a year or two in 10 Downing Street or in the Italian government. And that sort of works to some extent. And the really smart people are often keen to find a way where they can keep their corporate careers and their equity, etc., but also do something for society. We've got to make those offerings quite attractive. Otherwise, the asymmetry of expertise between governments and business is enormous. But overall, I think this is an era where many people do want to, they realize governments play a huge role on climate change or in pandemics or in solving problems of poverty, which is never going to be fixed by Google.
Yeah, it's a bigger problem in tech, though, right? This is, as you touched on, it's certainly in the industry that I work in and we talk about a lot. Like tech is it's the best minds. I mean, not all clearly, but the best minds clearly are going in the other direction. But I take your point. Maybe there's some new models that might make them back.
And maybe just to give 2 or 3 examples, so probably the biggest digital project of the last 15 years, India, the UID, Aadhaar under Nandan Nilekani. So he'd made loads of money in business, and he then has become essentially a public servant for 15 years, doing amazing things in India, far ahead of Europe. Estonia has a really good team who are probably, again, the best country in Europe, and Ukraine actually has also got extraordinary digital public services now, but they've pulled in people from the corporate side to help them. Italy had a very senior guy from Amazon to run their digital for a few years, and he did a great job. So there's actually lots of examples of people, pretty senior positions in digital tech business, sort of doing their, realizing they had a role to play in public service as well, not as an alternative.
From where I've been watching this, I think, with respect, Dan, the bigger challenge is there's all this talk that people don't trust government, but does government trust the public? And I think often real engagement with the public to create, social license is seen as a risk. I've seen it at federal level, state level, local levels, that you actually don't want the voices to get in the way of the plans you've put in place. So to stretch the metaphor, you don't want someone telling you to put the pipe somewhere else, and you don't want, messy water in the system either. And Geoff, I think one of the interesting things with the work HTI is doing is sort of trying to make a virtue out of the qualitative feedback you can get when you engage citizens on social issues to help you make better decisions, the way technology can help that. But I do see, and again, you've worked in a political office, you've worked in other parts of government, that sense that friction is a risk and something to be avoided seems to be the biggest barrier to moving this forward.
This is again where the detail is all important. If you have a permanent referendum on every policy, it'll be a disaster. But it's very interesting, certainly in Europe, if you poll people, their sense of trust in government closely correlates with whether they feel they have a say on how decisions are made, a sense of agency. So that's the reason why, if you're a smart government, you try and involve people in decisions. You give them some say, whether it's at a very neighborhood level, where to build the new play center, or on very big issues like assisted dying, which is a great issue in many countries at the moment. Or, as many cities do, you give a slice of the budget for participatory budgeting. Paris does that. London's got one. And so I think you finding many of the, particularly mayors, it's a bit more at a city level than a national level now, being pretty, radical in trying to use technology to enhance democracy, to give the public more say, recognizing there will be a friction, an uncertainty and unpredictability. But if you calibrate it right, that can actually help you deliver complex, difficult policies with more public support, more legitimation, and you can tap into public knowledge as well to shape your policies. It's not just about getting them to say, do I like this or don't I like this? There's a huge untapped collective intelligence in every society, which most political systems completely ignore. And I think the best ones are realizing that may help you deliver your housing plans, your energy plans, your school plans, rather than being, you call it a friction, sometimes it's actually a fuel.
Yeah, the example that comes to mind for me actually is the referendum in Ireland on abortion, where also the reference to a citizens' jury to deliberate on what question ought to be put to the public, and then the endorsement through a referendum process. Not just was about involving the public in the deliberation, but also incentivizing that kind of engagement. Like, people went door knocking to talk about it because they're given the opportunity to be asked a question and answer it. Like, it also reminds me of the discussion that we've had on this podcast with Alondra Nelson a little while back, where she was involved in drafting the AI Bill of Rights under the Biden administration. But she talked about having like office hours where people could call up her office, anyone, and talk to her about this policy. Like, not her, but, there was an openness to engaging with the public on these topics in a way that I think is actually rare. I don't know, as somebody who does try to engage with policymakers a lot, like, it is hard to sometimes go along to consultations and feel like you're being listened to, even if you're organised and you are representing more than just yourself. And in fact, some of the tech sort of mitigates against that. Like, we're seeing, governments invest in technology to synthesize and summarize submissions put to them, rather than engaging with the substance of those submissions themselves. Now, that there are, there's limitations on what's possible in government in terms of that consultation, and understandably, if you get 20,000 submissions, you may not want to read them all. But you do want to use the tech in a way to ask questions of people, not just try to contract their involvement in the process. Is that, do you think it's time we started experimenting with other ways of getting people into the conversation in the way that like Alondra is doing, or what are the key kind of ways in which you think tech can be harnessed in like practical ways to do that kind of work of public engagement, Geoff?
I'm quite an enthusiast for AI, actually, because I think, lots of different AI tools can help a group of 1,000 or 10,000 or 1 million or 10 million to not just do the traditional government method where you say, we're open for a consultation, send in your suggestions, and then, as you say, you get an AI to summarize it, but rather to create clusters of groups to help people respond to each other's ideas, to try and forge consensus rather than polarization. There's lots of methods for doing that.
Sounds like you've been talking to Audrey Tang.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Polis has been around for years, has been used in many, many countries now, but there's actually a whole suite of other tools of that kind, using often LLMs or multiple LLMs to support these different stages of democracy. And to me, that's a no-brainer. I'm also quite keen on AI agents, where you might actually have a number of agents to help your own participation, perhaps one representing you as a parent, one as your economic interests, one your moral values, and interrogating, politicians and parties about what their options are. There's huge dangers from AI. Last year, I published a thing on how we protect elections from deepfake synthetic material, which is a missing institution in all of our societies. And at the moment, it's worth saying both Russia and China are investing huge sums of money in disrupting elections and sowing confusion and chaos and misinformation. We've got to protect ourselves from that. But overall, I actually think AI has potential to be a huge part of the reimagining of democracy, so people can feel more, not just feel agency, but actually exercise agency over decisions made in their name.
Hold on. So you're saying we have an AI agent that goes out and represents our interests based on our footprint, and then it's talking to another AI? Like, is there any people in that discussion?
Right, no, it might be advising us how to vote. I mean, one of the problems with representative democracy is you're expecting all of your 20 million adults or whatever to understand incredibly complex issues and make very complicated decisions about specific issues or which party to support and so on. And I think we need to somewhat disaggregate all of that, but with coaches and aids to help people make judgments. I'm not, you don't want a referendum on tariff policy or monetary policy or things like that. But you
Wasn't that the job of your trade union or your neighbourhood, your precinct committee back in the day? Like, isn't it better to have...
It was. People used to have these representative membership bodies, but certainly in where I live, they've disappeared almost completely. And there's nothing between you and the mass media, you and the state. And that's one of the reasons for distrust, that's one of the reasons people feel disconnected from power.
Do you think government's got a role to play in making that easier for people as well? Like, part of it is that maybe they have to make their processes more legible, more transparent, so that people can navigate them in a more meaningful way. Like, I'm up for people building tools and stuff, but part of it is there has been a culture of obfuscation or otherwise.
Yeah. No, I think many governments have got captured by rather old-fashioned comms teams who thought it was all about controlling the message and, broadcast messages, which 20 or 30 years ago did work quite well. It now doesn't work at all. And that's why, exactly as you say, you've got to rewire the inside of the state so it can cope with a different kind of dialogue and conversation, a much more relational approach to citizens, but also vary it. So it'll be very different when you're talking about health from when you're talking about, defense policy or from, public spaces. So it's important not to generalize. I see democracy is actually quite a messy, complicated, varied thing, and what works for, as I say, a national debate on assisted dying will be very different, or abortion, as in Ireland, will be very different from a decision on what you do about house building in Melbourne or Sydney.
You strike me as like a very kind of effervescent, kind of futuristic Vogon, like the Vogons from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy were these notorious bureaucrats that just would send pieces of paper endlessly around Byzantine systems. And you're like, no, there's nothing wrong with the bureaucracy. It's just the energy and direction and orientation of it. We've just got to make sure it's not too circular. And I kind of like that idea. I feel like the Vogons were an unfortunate kind of bad publicity.
It was the poetry that was terrible, Lizzie.
The poetry was terrible, yeah.
I don't know if is that your bent as well, Geoff? Are you a poet? Have you got any Vogon poetry?
I'm not a good poet, but I do
write it. The second, was it the third worst poetry in the galaxy? Anyway, we digress. Dan, where do you want to take this?
Yeah.
It's hard to follow that up, isn't it? So, Geoff, is education part of the plumbing as part of this? I mean, I guess I'm with you on the need to, use technology to sort of make it easier for people to participate in democracy. And I think there's definitely ways that we can do that better. But it seems that most people's understanding of technology, particularly when it comes to older generations, is pretty limited. And also the technology that they are learning to use is controlled by private enterprise mostly at the moment. So how do you get to a position where if you're going to be relying on technology to use to basically improve the engagement with democracy and democratic processes, surely that's going to come with a huge amount of education with people on how to use them as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. Just two little small answers. I mean, one is I teach undergraduates and graduates and sometimes do sessions in schools where we try to get them to use a lot of different AI tools to design policies or ideas, but then also to critique them, to see where they've got things wrong, where they've made factual errors, to develop mathematical models, see their errors. So you're constantly looping both familiarity with using the tools, but also skepticism of them. And I think that's what we need to be learning from a very early age, enthusiasm and skepticism. And the one other thing we badly need in schools is what does happen in Denmark and Finland to some extent is systematic teaching about misinformation. How do you spot when you're being lied to? And certainly in the UK, most school kids have no idea about that. They are so easily manipulated by industrial scale lying. And there's many other things I think we need to do to fix that one, including new laws. But at a minimum, this needs to be part of the general education of any young person today, so they're not easy victims for monstrous manipulators.
So can I give you a design challenge as we round this out, Geoff? So, and maybe we're asking you to do our job, but given both your government and our government have basically, with AI, said nothing to see here, let's just deal with problems as they arise. How would you design up models or ways that citizens could have more of a say in how this technology is going to come on before it destroys jobs, before it obliterates culture, before it undermines democracy, and before it makes Dan a multimillionaire?
So about 10 years ago, I published an attempt at answering
now, Peter.
Yeah.
Sorry, go on.
I published an attempt at answering that question, which was what should an AI regulator look like? This was, 11 years ago. And the idea was it wasn't a single body which tried to regulate all AI, but rather a kind of meta-regulator which would work with the individual sector regulators in finance or air traffic or energy and so on, partly where there were cross-cutting issues like facial recognition, but also giving them the expertise, the knowledge to know what was an appropriate rule adaptation in their sectors. And in some of those, you wouldn't really involve the public very much. But in others, like the balance of use of algorithms and data in health, you would obviously involve the public. And we ran focus groups, again, it's 8-9 years ago, with the public on the pros and cons of different uses of AI in different kinds of health contexts. I don't think it's very hard to do this, but not a single country on the planet has yet done this. And one of the models which I referred to then was human fertilization, which 35 years ago was this big set of technologies on IVF and cloning and so on. There was a great debate in Parliament, in the nation, about the balance of technology and science and ethics on the other hand. An entity was created to regulate that, talking to the public in a very active way about their preferences. And we've had 35 years of pretty good scientific advance in that field without massive backlashes from the churches or anyone else, because it's balanced the human, the ethical, and the scientific and the technological. And to my mind, it's one of the great tragedies of history that nothing like that was created for the internet. Nothing like that's been created for AI. And as a result, we have overreach and then horrible pathologies along with the gains. And this is, to me, just a symptom of slightly deficient collective intelligence that we've so signally failed to govern these technologies in a wise way.
And before we go, tell us about your upcoming book on, I can't remember, is it about stupidity or dumb decisions?
So quite a while ago, I wrote a book for Princeton University Press on collective intelligence, and I still teach it and give talks on it. And I realized that more and more people thought I was talking about the wrong thing because this is the era of collective stupidity, and hadn't I noticed? And so I've been, for the last couple of years, researching why is it that organizations and indeed societies full of really clever people and really smart technology do really stupid things sometimes. And so I've just finished a book which attempts a kind of theory, lots of examples, and crucially a whole set of remedies of how do you avoid an epidemic of collective stupidity, whether it's in companies or nations or the world as a whole.
Do we have to wait till the book comes out to get
Yeah.
the spoiler there? Hey,
Essential knowledge we need. I wouldn't mind getting.
Nothing bad's going to happen between now and publication date. Don't worry. And are you doing any? I know you're doing a few university events. Are you doing any public addresses while you're out there? If people are interested, we can put something. So
Yeah,
Sydney Uni.
I'm doing one for Sydney Uni on the 12th of February in the evening at Marrickville Library, and one for the Australian New Zealand School of Government, also in Sydney, a week later, or 2 weeks later.
Excellent. We'll put some links of that in there. Hey, thanks a lot for spending some time with us, and really looking forward to meeting you in person as well. Lizzie, you're off to India, I believe, to the AI Safety Summit.
Yep, looking forward to that Impact Summit.
Impact. So it's not about safety anymore; it's about impact.
Yeah.
So I'll be very excited to hear what you learn when you return. And
Yep.
Dan, anything with you?
Nothing that's going to be of interest to this listenership, no, but I'll keep plugging on.
Hey, everyone, thanks a lot, and we'll catch up in a fortnight.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on February 3 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.